Hi, this is Professor Wiseman here out at Docks Branch, a tributary of Stroubles Creek on the Virginia Tech campus today in Blacksburg, Virginia. This is the first day of spring, March 19th, 2020, and we're out here today to spend some time with some contractors who are doing some riparian buffer tree planting out here on Docks Branch, and we're going to talk with these folks about what they're doing out here today, what they hope to accomplish, and how this all fits into natural resource conservation and urban and community forestry. Okay, Rodney, we're on. Thank you for having us out here today. Tell us a little bit about your business, if you would, to start with.
So Conservation Services has been around since the year 2000, and we do large-scale hardwood tree establishment projects. So we do more than just putting the trees in the ground, but we offer a full slate of services from planning the project to site preparation, to the turnkey planting of the project, and follow-up maintenance until we get to the point of establishment, because as you'll find out, a lot of times if you just stick a tree in the ground and leave it, it may or may not be there in a year.
Right. And I understand that you're a Hokie alum, so tell us about your experience at Tech real quickly, what you majored in, and how you ended up getting into this business.
Sure. I started my forestry studies at Virginia Tech in 1999 and graduated in 2003 in the forest resource management option, and it was a really great experience here. I love it down in Blacksburg. Always love to get back anytime I can. So I was really happy to be able to do this project, and I did some other things before starting my own consulting business around the year 2011. And then very, very shortly after that, got picked up by Conservation Services to come and be a tree planting coordinator for them. And that's how I got into the business, and that was in 2012. So, you know, I'm going on a little after 8 years of doing tree plantings.
Excellent. So how far does your business go in terms of geographic range?
We are a growing business. As of right now, in the year 2020, we are planting from New York all the way over to Ohio, all the way down to Texas, and everywhere in between on the East Coast.
And so, as I would understand it, you're probably starting to reach near the end of your planting season, is that right?
This would have been a great year for me to say yes, but most of the time in the Mid-Atlantic, the planting season is March and April. But this year I could have been planting in February. The issue with that is there's a lot of logistics that go into running a tree planting business, and if I have a crew that comes in on a warm February and then all of a sudden there's a cold snap for 4 weeks and they have nothing to do, that doesn't work out. So typically March and April in the Mid-Atlantic, and then the month of mid-November through mid-December is our fall planting season.
And you're on a fairly tight window because of the type of trees that you're planting, is that right?
That's right. So we plant almost exclusively bareroot seedlings, and bareroot seedlings can only be planted when they're dormant. If you try to transplant them when they are actively growing, they're going to desiccate very quickly, and you're not going to have a very good survival. So one of the things that we do is, and that's why we have to wait until very late in November, is we got to wait until those trees go dormant before the nurseries will lift them. They get them to us, and we plant them very quickly. So it's a very short window of time, both in the fall and the spring, very seasonal for tree planting. And the other thing is, because of that, because there's such a small window, we're planting at least 6 days a week, and it takes a lot of effort to coordinate job after job after job after job after job to keep these workers moving to get all the trees in the ground.
Right. Now, these are conservation plantings that your business specializes in. Are they exclusively riparian restoration, or do you plant trees in other places?
We do a lot of this type of planting here where there's a stream exclusion, and we plant inside of the stream exclusion. But we also plant in created wetlands. We also plant in nutrient banks and forest conservation banks, where they're trying to build or enhance the overall tree canopy cover in a county.
And so we're not in the Chesapeake Bay watershed right here. We're just over the hill from it. On the other side of Blacksburg, you get back into a very small portion of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. But is a lot of your restoration plantings driven by the Chesapeake Bay program and trying to revegetate some of these stream sides?
Very much so. A lot of our plantings happen in Virginia, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, a lot in Maryland, and there's a lot of plantings. We don't do a lot, but there's a lot of plantings in Pennsylvania and even New Jersey. And a lot of the funding for that comes from these sources that are interested in cleaning up the bay. And because of that, because that Virginia and Maryland and these states have such a longer history than a lot of other places of putting money towards tree planting projects, the types of projects that are in Virginia and Maryland particularly tend to be a lot more advanced in their development than some of the places that may not have had that sort of funding in the past, and are just starting with conservation tree plantings.
So we're in a rural setting today, although much of the Stroubles Creek watershed is impacted by the town of Blacksburg. This type of planting here, is the goal here to get vegetation in back along this stream that's been impacted by cattle grazing in the past? What exactly is going on this particular site?
So this site here looks to me like it used to be an agricultural site where cows and or farming went right up to the creek, and that's how it is in a lot of these places, if not most of these places that we plant. And because of that, the stream itself begins to degrade. Sometimes they've actually channelized the stream to make it better for agriculture. So a lot of the projects that we do, some of them are actually even restoring the sinuosity of the stream, and but the more simple projects are excluding the stream with the fencing, and then we're planting trees and shrubs within that fencing. What that does is it helps filter nutrients, it helps stabilize the banks, the soils, so they don't erode so quickly. And what you'll find, this is a very, there's no trees here right at the moment. So if I try to walk across that stream right there, it's very, very mucky and a lot of sediment in there. But what we find is that tree plantings that have been there for 10, 15, 20 years and have really started to kick in with their functions, you walk through there and there's actually a hard stream bed beginning to develop in a lot of places, because there's not that sediment loading that's continuing there, and that it's being held together by the trees a little bit better.
Okay, good. So we had talked earlier that you don't just plant in these rural or agricultural settings, but sometimes you find yourself doing plantings in more urban areas. Could you give some examples of urban areas where you find yourself doing these plantings, and maybe talk a little bit about what the differences are between the two settings?
Sure. So one of the places that we have recently planted was at a golf course, and that golf course, like other places, the stream itself was degraded because they would mow right up to it, and the nutrient loading from a golf course is pretty heavy. So they had a company come in and do the excavation work to restore the stream sinuosity, and they had us come in and do the revegetation. So that was in the middle of a city, and it was a planting very similar to this, but there are some key differences. The closer you get to those really urban settings, there's a lot more emphasis on what it looks like. And so if you look at this, this is the tree shelters that are out here. Not everybody likes what that looks like, but so there's a more emphasis on what it looks like, and sometimes there's more of an emphasis on the exact placement. So there's a little bit of crossover here, and sometimes I have to explain to people when we start with the contracting discussion that we're not landscapers. We do reforestation, and so we're not so interested in putting a particular species of tree in a particular exact location. We're more interested in production, and so there's some things that you have to deal with there. A lot of times, because of that crossover there, it increases the per unit cost of putting in a tree planting like this. This exact tree planting put in the middle of a city would have a higher cost because of a lot of those factors.
And those clients in urban areas, what's typically motivating them to contract your services? Are they responding to some regulatory requirement? Is it just a community conservation movement, all of the above?
I would say that most of it is probably driven by regulatory factors. For instance, one of the things we do is we plant in wetlands, and so if you have a large box store that's going in an urban area, and they have to destroy a wetland, they have to build twice as much back, and so that's where that's one of the places that these sorts of projects come from. A lot of municipalities are also after the credits they get from reducing their nutrient loading into streams, and so they're looking for any sort of projects like this, especially on degraded streams, that will really help them get their credits that they need so they don't have to buy them somewhere else. And then there are a few community groups like Friends of the Name Your Own River that you live nearby, and they have an interest in protecting that stream, and they'll call us up to do it, or call us up for the materials so they can do it as volunteers.
So I'm looking there in the background, and I see that there's quite a few tree tubes already out there. Talk for a moment just about the scope of your work out here today. What are you adding to that's already out there? What are you planting? How many? And so forth.
So before we got here, there had already been a few plantings that had taken place. There was some live stakes that were put in right along the stream corridor, and there were a few places where hardwood trees in tree shelters had been planted. And some of the bigger trees that you can see out here were planted, and you can tell by the way that they're growing that they had a tree shelter on them. What we have been asked to do is to provide another 810 hardwood trees, and some of those tree shelters come out here and put them in a very random fashion, approximately 10 by 10, which is a 436 tree to the acre density. And so we've already laid all of the materials out there. Nothing has been installed yet, nothing has been planted yet. We're about to get ready to bag up our trees and to get ready with the planting.
Okay. And how long will this project take you to complete these 800 and some odd trees?
That always depends on the site, but typically one tree planter should be able to plant anywhere from 125 to 200 trees in tree shelters per day. Okay. If we're not using tree shelters, you know, one planter might plant as many as 1,500 or 2,000 in a day.
Okay, and what's your goal for survival out here? I know that varies quite a bit from factors sometimes that are or not within your control, but what would be your goal here when we say we come back a year from now, or 3 years from now, or 5 years from now?
Sure. Tree planting is like a lot of other things where you sort of get what you put into it. And so if you go out and buy 1,000 hardwood seedlings and you just plant them out there into that tall grass, you're going to get a very poor survival, maybe 5% survival, maybe 10%, because of deer, because of rodents that live in that thick grass. So this system is designed in a way that we can put it in and more or less leave it, because a lot of these projects are 5, 10, even 15,000 trees, and it's not like you're going to go back to every one of those trees and water them. So this system is designed to protect from the most the most critical things that might impact survival. So we use the 2x tree shelter, and it's designed to be installed over top of a very small bare root seedling, pushed into the ground about 2 to 3 inches, and you put a stake beside it. And we are on this project putting a weed mat to control competing vegetation around it, although a lot of people will use herbicide to do that. Once that's in there, and if it's correctly installed, then our crews typically will get somewhere between 70 to 95% survival after 2 or 3 years. And once you get past 3 to 5 years, if it's there, it probably will stay there. I mean, it's got a good chance of competing with everything around it.
Okay. And so kind of a range from minimal aftercare would be doing nothing at all. What would be at the other extremity there in terms of a premium service? Would you come back and remove tubes, weed mats, etc.? What might you do there?
So I would say the high end of what we've been asked to do is to, when we plant them in rows. So with rows, as you look at it this way, it looks random, but you still have the ability to maintain your project. And so we plant it in rows. We come back the first 3 to 5 years, once a year, and we put down an herbicide around each shelter or in strips along the rows. That keeps down the competing vegetation. We come back and do what we call tree shelter maintenance, because inevitably you're going to have 1 or 2 of these stakes that break off, or a big deer comes through and busts one down, or maybe the cows come in and accidentally get in and knock over a couple. So we fix anything like that. On the top of these shelters, we put a bird net on it to keep birds. A lot of times if a bird sits up on top of there and they see a little bug down there, they'll jump for it, and usually when they jump for it, they get stuck, and when that happens, most of the time both the tree and the bird die. So we put a little bird net on it, and part of tree shelter maintenance is pulling that down. And then we monitor and treat invasive species control problems. And then we even will come through and mow the grass in between the rows down. Now that's whether you do that part or not, it definitely makes it look the project look better, and so you'll see that asked for a lot more times in urban settings. And if you have weeds that are going to grow 9 feet tall, it probably does help with sunlight, but if you have small grasses, it's probably not necessary.
So it's perhaps one part amenity and another part growth and survival as well.
Yeah.
And my last question I'll ask is, what species are we planting out here today, and why were those species chosen?
Well, the species mix that was chosen for this one includes, for what we're planting, is all taller stature trees. And the species list is not on the top of my head, so I apologize for that.
We'll get that later, yeah.
But the one thing about my job as a tree planter, I am an SAF certified forester. However, I don't write many planting plans, and there's a good reason for that. I don't know the nuances of every single place I go to, so I let the professionals that are in each place decide what their project needs. And I work with them, give them advice on what I think might work and what might not work. So I see a lot of different planting plans from a lot of different engineers, foresters, and landowners. And so on this particular project, I didn't make it up. So I didn't make up the species list. And the person who designed the project and contracted with us, he's the one that made up the species list, and we supplied that.
I understand that one of the big challenges out here in revegetating these is combating the woody invasives that come in, and I think that was perhaps played into the species selection, is trying to get some overstory so that they can shade out those invasives. How big a deal are the invasives? I know that invasive plants are just a huge problem in the eastern United States overall, but particularly with these types of plantings. Huge challenge for getting them established and maintained?
It A lot of times it is, but with good site preparation, you can really cut down your after planting maintenance costs, especially on a planting like this, which is randomized, and it's hard to get in there with any sort of equipment to do mowing or spraying. It would be all walking backpack handwork. So with good site preparation, you can get a good head start on it. But you're right. If you just leave this grass to compete right around the base of the trees, the newly planted trees, or if you have something like autumn olive or Oriental bittersweet that comes in, and now that you've excluded that, now you're not working in there, it's not being mowed down at all, it just has a heyday. So that's why it's very important to monitor these sorts of projects and treat them as appropriate. Maple, this one is wet. I'll take 2 of these as wet, 2 of them as dry. All right. So here, so these here are wet, and those, and those up there are dry.
So what you up to there?
Giving the trees a little drink.
Okay.
The roots dry out.
A little windy today?
A little windy,
Yeah.
a little sunny, a little warmer than we were planning.
Right.
The roots dry out, you have less survivability. So.
Yep. Good.
Well, what they're doing now is they're what we call bagging up,
Uh-huh.
and they take the different species and they mix them up. And sometimes the bareroot seedlings come to us in a with very, very long roots. And
I saw some of the pruning going on, yeah.
Yeah, and so we use a hodad, which has the blade is only this long, and so if we don't prune the roots, then what happens is that root gets kind of just stuffed in there, and it does what's called a J root. And So we try to prevent that. It's better for us to prune it a little and not have that than to just try to stuff it in a small hole.
So they've been prepping the trees for the last few minutes, sorting them. I noticed that you were instructing them on different species for the wetter spots and the drier spots. Right. Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
And sometimes that's as simple as these are wet, these are dry. Sometimes it's more complex because there's a mixture of shrubs and taller stature trees, and sometimes there's flowering things. So sometimes there's more complex constructions, but on this project it's basically a mixture of the species mix that goes throughout.
And so is there a division of labor here? Does one person dig, one person stick the tree, one person put the tube, or does each person do all steps on their own for a little planting area?
Yeah, each person knows how to do it and does it for, each person knows how to do everything. There are some jobs when it does make sense to have sort of the assembly line mentality, have one person do this thing and one person do that thing, but most of the plantings, everybody just does everything.
Okay. Yep. And how would you describe the conditions out here today for planting? Suboptimal, optimal?
The ground conditions are about optimal. There's a lot of moisture from the rain yesterday, and we're near the creek. But it is definitely a little bit warmer than I would like for a planting day. Normally ideal planting weather is about 34 degrees up to about 45 degrees. Okay. That's about perfect.
And so what are the risks and the precautions then for today with the elevated temperatures?
So especially with elevated temperatures and the wind, the roots will desiccate a little bit quicker. And so we try to keep them in the bags, and if the roots start drying out, we will give them a little water. We use a thermal tarp, so after they're done getting all the trees, any trees that are left at the bag pile, I will put under that thermal tarp to keep the sun and the wind off of them, just to try to keep their temperature down, because things start happening when those trees start warming up, and they start to need water, and they dry out quick.
Yeah.
You don't, again, you won't need to space it yet. For right now, we're just plants and gather behind the gather. Everybody can go through, put stages in their bag, and pick whatever I'm ready. Upstream. All right, so when you put this system together, it comes together with several different components. The first thing is the seedling. It's a bareroot seedling. it gets planted first. They scalp the sod away right there. They put they plant the tree, and they try to plant it so that the root collar is right about at the ground level. They firm it up really good to get any air pockets out. Once the tree is planted, the next thing to do is to put the tree shelter on. Now this is a 2x tree shelter, and it has several features in how it was designed and engineered as a tree shelter. It is double walled, which helps with strength of the tree shelter. This is called a combi tube, and it's ventilated, which allows air movement into the shelter. There's some that are not ventilated, just called a standard tree shelter. It's held to the stake by zip ties. These zip ties are reclosable so that you can do maintenance on the tree or reuse the shelter if needed. This shelter also has two what we call strengthening rods, which is a little bit thicker plastic, which the zip tie goes around. That way with the wind, it doesn't pull out nearly as easy. And the last thing, and you can see it really good on this shelter, it has a flared top. When that tree comes out of there and it's moving around like this, because it has a flared top, it's never impacting the sharp edge of the plastic. That keeps it from getting abrasions on the stem of the tree. Just about the most important feature of the tree shelter is what's called a laser line, and it looks like a perforated line that goes down the length of the shelter. That laser line is engineered to split open when the tree diameter gets to the same diameter as the tree shelter. If you don't have that, like if you use a corrugated pipe or something, that plastic will girdle the tree. So you'll have a really nice tree, and then about year 15, when that diameter gets to the same size as the corrugated pipe, it'll girdle it and kill it, and you're back to ground zero. So these are engineered because, if you can imagine, we'll have a field of 5,000 of those, and they might not get out there to every one at the exact right time to cut them off. So it's engineered to split open, and it looks like when that happens, it looks like it's unzipping from the bottom, and then it just sloughs off, falls off, and you just don't have to worry about it girdling the tree, and all you have to do is go and pick up that tree shelter later on. So after the tree is planted, the shelter is put over top of the tree, and it's worked into the ground about 2 to 3 inches. That keeps voles, meadow voles, from burrowing underneath of it and getting to the tree. The tree shelter itself, of course, is mainly for deer protection. It protects the young seedling from getting eaten by the deer and reducing survival. The other thing that happens, because we have 4-foot and 5-foot shelters depending on the deer pressure and how big they are, it helps you to maintain a central leader. So if you're just protecting against a vole, you might have something this small, but the deer can still make it a multi-stemmed oak tree. With these, it helps protect that terminal leader, making a nice form of a tree. Once the tree shelter is put over the tree, you install the stake. Now normally a 4-foot stake is paired with a 4-foot shelter, and when that happens, you would drive the stake all the way down to about 2 inches from the top of the zip tie. These are 5-foot stakes, so they don't drive down quite as far. After the stake is driven, and usually I give the tree planters an orientation. It's either upstream, or it's north, or towards the windward side, depending on where we're planting. Once the stake gets driven in, the zip tie gets cinched down tight, and now that tree shelter is on there.
So the orientation of the stake is just to give it the best support it possibly can based on water flow or wind currents?
Yep, and if you're not worried about those, you would plant it to, you would put the stake to the north, so that, because we're in the northern hemisphere, you have less blockage of sunlight. The tree shelter itself is basically, instead of taking the tree to the greenhouse, we're taking the greenhouse to the tree. And they're designed to be translucent to allow certain wavelengths of light into the growing tree. What you will find with that is an accelerated growth, especially in the solid wall tree shelters, where that tree doesn't have much movement back and forth. If you have physical movement, it stimulates the tree to put on more girth and root growth, which slows down the growth of the tree. So that's why a vented shelter is a lot of times a more premium choice. But the solid wall shelter also does a great job. The idea behind the tree shelter is not only protecting from deer and voles, but even though it's an added expense at the beginning of a project, you're basically buying time, in the sense that if you didn't put any tree shelters out here and you just let the deer eat them, make them multi-stemmed, you replanted several times until you got the survival you want, it might take you 2, 3, or 4 times of replanting to get the survival that you want. Whereas with these, you can plant a lower density to get ultimately the same density that you want, and in 5, 6, 7 years, now you're looking at how big your trees are. You don't have to worry about replanting, so you've gained that extra time that you would have been maybe replanting another time. So the tree shelter's on, the stake is installed, the zip tie is cinched tight. On this project, for competition control, we're using weed mats, and so instead of herbicide for competition control. So the weed mat is a 3 foot by 3 foot Vispor weed mat, and it has a direction. There's a shiny side and there's a matte finish side. There are micro pores that allow water to go through but resist weeds from coming back up through. So you always want the shiny side up. That allows the water to go down and the weeds to stay down. And what this will do is it will smother these weeds underneath of it. After a year, you might see that the weeds around the side have grown up and fallen over, and it looks like they're there, but you can pull those away, and the mat is actually doing its job. There's a slit in the middle of the mat, and you just put that over top of the tree shelter all the way down, and at this point you stretch it out. This is where site preparation can really help. If you have very tall grass, when you do this, you'll get the weed mat taut as good as you can. But if there's big clumps of grass, such as this one right here, as that grass dies, the weed mat will not be as tight. And so if you bush hog it down for site prep, you'll get a little bit better of a finish on all of these mats, and they'll stay tight longer. The weed mat is held in place on the corners by 4 what we call sod staples, and basically you roll the corner or you fold the corner so it's doubled over, and you just push this into the ground. Now the weed mat is installed, and the very last thing to do is to put the bird net on. The bird net goes on just like you're putting on a sock. And we like to pull that down until there's a hole in the middle of the bird net right there about the size of a quarter. When that's done, the tree is complete and you go on to the next tree.
Yeah.
So is today a good day to plant? What do you think?
Yeah, today is a nice day. We got it sunny, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not that cold.
Right. Is it too hot for you?
No, it's okay.
It's
the sun
okay?
is great. The sun is great.
Okay.
You know? Yeah.
All right.
We got a lot of sun like this in Jamaica every day, you know. Jamaica
Right.
is a sunny place.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we don't have snow in Jamaica, you know.
No snow.
No snow. You guys have everything here. In the winter, you got the snow, you know. But we got the beautiful sunshine there. That's how you do it. And this is called the hodad.
Hodad.
The hodad.
Yeah, the hodad.
Border dirt.
Yeah.
All true. And we just
Right,
keep
true.
on planting.
Planting.
Put over the shelter. Jam the stakes.
And here you got the shelters.
I saw you all sharpening your hodads.
Yeah, we were sharpening the hodad.
You do that every day or?
No, not every day.
Not every day.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Sometimes we go in an area on
Yeah,
a side
like the
that's
most rocky place.
it's rocky.
Uh-huh.
So after we finish the rocky place,
We sharpen the hodads, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
But it is a nice day for tree to plant. Nice planting day.
This is the hammer, you know? Use and pound the stakes. Yeah, this is how you do it.
All right.
Yeah. And these are all 5-foot shelters. Yeah, yeah. And we got the 5-foot stake in too. And we got some short 2-foot stakes, but we're not planting any today. Yeah.
Okay.
And this is the zip tie we use to lock the tube. Yeah. That's how we do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in addition to planting the bare root seedlings in the tube shelters, there's also been some live staking that's been performed out here, and you can see some of these in the background. These are tiny stems that are cut from the recent growth of certain species of trees, and these are stuck into the ground. The live stakes will then develop roots on them from adventitious buds and develop into a new fully formed tree. So this is another way to quickly plant a lot of trees in a very dense area in a setting like this. The live staking usually doesn't work too well if you're in a very dry soil, but if you get down close to the edge of the water where the soil stays almost consistently or constantly moist, it will keep the live stakes from drying out until they develop roots. As they begin to develop roots, they will also develop adventitious buds that turn into shoots and leaves, and then once the plant gets established, it'll turn into a fully formed new tree. The survival rate of these is not nearly as good as the bare root seedlings, but they are very, very quick to plant and very inexpensive to plant, and so it's another option for doing restoration plantings in a project like this where you're trying to cover as much ground with as many trees as inexpensively as possible. Some more of the live stakes that have been planted right in the edge of the stream. These are typically very moisture tolerant species, such as willows. So you do the follow-up work with the weed mats?
Yep.
Okay. And how about your bird nets? When do those go on?
So they go on last
Okay.
after we put the mat on and checked out all the tubes just to make sure that everything's good.
Mm-hmm.
They go on last because when we put this net on there, the hole in the middle is kind of tight. And what it'll do is it'll strip the bird net down, and so then it's kind of useless at that point because it's just a collar around the tube instead of actually keeping the birds out.
Tricks of the trade.
Tricks of the trade.